There is something your soulmate has been trying not to remember, and the strange part is that their own mind keeps bringing it back to them. They may have believed that enough time, enough distance, and enough silence would eventually make you feel like a distant chapter, something they could think about without feeling anything. But lately, something has changed. A random song, a familiar phrase, a place you once shared, or even the smallest detail about you suddenly pulled an old memory to the surface. And for a moment, they were right back there with you, not remembering the big moments, remembering something tiny, something they had no reason to still know, the way you used to react when you were trying not to smile, a little expression you made, something you once told them casually and probably assumed they had forgotten. And that is what unsettled them. Because how can someone you supposedly moved past still occupy such specific corners of your memory? They may have asked themselves, why do I still remember that? And perhaps even more quietly, why does remembering it still make me feel something? Imagine opening an old room you haven't entered in years and discovering that everything is still exactly where you left it. That is what this realization feels like for them. They thought the door was closed, but one small memory opened it again. And now they are beginning to question something they once felt certain about. Maybe the silence between you did not erase the connection. Maybe it simply gave them enough distance to finally realize how deeply it stayed with them. Because sometimes the smallest memories survive for one reason. The person connected to them mattered far more than we were ready to admit. And now comes the part that may be even more difficult for them to explain. They are not just remembering you, they are remembering details they had no intention of keeping. That is what makes this realization different. Anyone can remember the obvious moments, the first meeting, the important conversation, the day everything changed. But your soulmate may be remembering the things that were never supposed to become permanent memories. A particular expression on your face, the way you became quiet when something bothered you, the little way you reacted when you were genuinely happy, a sentence you said without thinking twice, something you liked, something you avoided, something you once mentioned in passing and probably assumed disappeared from their mind the moment the conversation ended. Yet somehow it stayed, and now they are beginning to notice just how much stayed. They may have been going through an ordinary day when a completely unrelated moment suddenly reminded them of you. And instead of the memory disappearing after a few seconds, it opened into another memory and then another, almost like one thread pulling an entire hidden tapestry out from somewhere they thought was empty. Imagine finding an old photograph inside a book you haven't opened for years. You pick it up expecting to feel nothing, but the moment you see it, you remember exactly where you were, what the room looked like, what was happening before the picture was taken, and even how that person made you feel. That is the kind of memory your soulmate may be experiencing now. Not a simple recollection, but an emotional chain reaction. And this is where their mind starts asking a question they may not be comfortable answering. If this person meant so little, why do I remember so much? Because the mind does not always preserve what was important according to logic. Sometimes it preserves what carried emotion. It stores the moments that made something inside you move, even when you were determined to move on. Your soulmate may have convinced themselves that the connection was just a chapter, something meaningful perhaps, but finished. They may have told themselves that enough time had passed and that whatever feelings existed belonged to another version of themselves. But these small memories are quietly challenging that story. They are showing them that forgetting was never as complete as they imagined. And perhaps that is why certain memories feel strangely alive when they return. They don't simply remember what you said. They remember how they felt when you said it. They don't just remember where you were. They remember what your presence did to the atmosphere around them. They don't just remember an ordinary afternoon. They remember why that ordinary afternoon suddenly feels important now. There is a difference between remembering someone and being emotionally reminded of them. One happens in the mind. The other happens somewhere deeper, And your soulmate may be discovering that the memories they thought were insignificant are actually the ones carrying the most emotional weight. You might be wondering, why would they remember the smallest things instead of the biggest moments? Because sometimes the biggest moments are too obvious. They are expected to be remembered. The little things are different. They reveal what the heart was quietly paying attention to when neither person was trying to make the moment meaningful. The way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention. The little habit they used to tease you about. The way you said their name. The moment you laughed at something that nobody else found funny. These are the fragments that can survive long after the larger story has become blurry. And now, those fragments may be forcing your soulmate to reconsider the emotional meaning of the entire connection. They may be realizing that they didn't just remember you because they once knew you. They remember you because some part of them was paying attention in a way they never fully acknowledged. Think about it like an old song you haven't heard in years. You may forget when you first heard it, where you were standing or what year it was, but the moment the melody begins, suddenly you know the next line. You know the rhythm. You know exactly where the emotional part arrives. That is how certain memories work. They don't need permission to return. They simply wait for the right trigger. And perhaps your soulmate is experiencing that now. Something keeps opening the door. Something keeps reminding them. And every time it happens, they are left with the same uncomfortable realization. They remember more about you than they ever expected. But the deeper question is not whether they remember. It is why these memories still carry emotional weight after all this silence. Because if the memories were truly meaningless, they would simply pass through. Instead, they linger. They make them pause. They make them wonder. They may even make them replay conversations they thought they had already forgotten, searching for something they missed the first time. And that is where this becomes much more personal for them. Because once someone starts questioning the meaning of their own memories, they eventually have to question the choices they made afterward. Your soulmate may not be ready to admit what that means yet. They may still be protecting themselves with logic, distance, or silence. But something inside them has already changed. They are no longer simply remembering the past. They are beginning to reinterpret it. And when the past starts looking different, the silence that followed it can start looking different too. Maybe they thought silence was helping them forget. Maybe they believed distance would make everything easier. But now they are discovering something they never expected. The memories survived anyway. And the more specific those memories become, the harder it becomes for them to believe that what happened between you was ever as easy to leave behind as they once told themselves. But now, the memories are doing something they were never supposed to do. They are making your soulmate question the silence itself. At first, they may have thought staying quiet was the easiest way to move forward. Maybe they believed that if they stopped reaching out, stopped asking questions, stopped looking back, eventually the emotional weight of your connection would disappear on its own. And perhaps for a while, they convinced themselves that it had. They kept moving. They focused on other things. They told themselves that whatever happened between you belonged in the past. But then these memories started returning, and suddenly the silence doesn't feel as simple as it once did. Because when someone remembers you in unexpected moments, they eventually start asking themselves why they never said what they really wanted to say. Why did they hold back? Why did they allow distance to grow? Why did they choose silence when there were still things left unresolved? And that question can become surprisingly difficult to escape. Your soulmate may be replaying old conversations now, not because they want to live in the past, but because they are beginning to notice all the places where they could have responded differently. Maybe there was a moment when they wanted to reach out but didn't. Maybe they typed something and deleted it. Maybe they convinced themselves that you would understand their silence, even though deep down they knew silence could easily be misunderstood. Imagine standing in front of a door you once chose not to open. At the time, walking away seemed easier. You told yourself there was nothing behind it that you needed anymore. Years later, you find yourself standing in front of the same door, realizing that the question was never whether you could open it. The question was why you were so afraid to. That may be where your soulmate is emotionally right now. They are looking back at a decision they once considered final and wondering whether it was actually a decision or simply a moment of fear disguised as certainty. And you might be wondering, if they are remembering me this much, why haven't they said anything? Because remembering someone and feeling ready to confront what those memories mean are two completely different things. Memories can arrive without warning, but vulnerability requires a choice. Your soulmate may still be caught between those two worlds. One part of them wants to understand why you remain so present in their mind, while another part is afraid of what the answer might require from them. Maybe reaching out would mean admitting they were wrong. Maybe it would mean acknowledging that the silence didn't bring closure. Maybe it would mean risking the possibility that you no longer feel the same way. And that last possibility can be enough to keep someone quiet for a very long time. Because sometimes people don't stay silent because they have nothing to say. They stay silent because they have too much to say and no idea how it will be received. Your soulmate may be realizing that now. They may be thinking about what you believed when they disappeared into silence. Did you think they didn't care? Did you think they had forgotten? Did you believe they had moved on completely? Those questions can weigh heavily when someone begins to understand that their silence may have communicated something completely different from what they actually felt. The strange thing about silence is that both people can experience it differently. One person can think, I'm giving them space, while the other hears, they don't want me anymore. One person can think, I'm protecting myself, while the other feels, I wasn't worth fighting for. And your soulmate may now be realizing that the space they created between you had a meaning they never intended to send. That realization can make old memories feel much heavier. Suddenly the little moments aren't just memories anymore. They become reminders of what was left unsaid. They may remember something you once told them and wonder whether they understood you correctly. They may remember the way you looked at them and wonder whether you were waiting for them to say something. They may remember a goodbye and wonder whether it really needed to become such a long silence. Imagine a letter sitting inside a drawer for years. The words don't change, but the person who wrote them does. And one day, when that letter is opened again, the meaning feels completely different because time has changed the eyes reading it. That may be what is happening with your soulmate. They are not simply revisiting old memories. They are seeing those memories through a completely different emotional lens. What once seemed ordinary now feels significant. What once felt finished now feels incomplete. What once looked like silence now looks like a decision they may not fully understand anymore. And this is where their questioning becomes deeper. They may ask themselves, did I stay silent because I truly wanted to let this go, or because I didn't know how to face what I felt? That is not an easy question, because if the answer is the second one, then they have to confront something they may have avoided for a long time. They didn't necessarily lose the connection because the feelings disappeared. They may have lost the opportunity to understand those feelings because they chose silence instead of vulnerability. And perhaps that is why these memories keep returning now. They are not simply asking your soulmate to remember you. They are asking them to reconsider the story they told themselves about why they stayed away. Maybe they thought silence was closure. Maybe now they are beginning to realize that silence was only distance. And distance can separate two people physically without ever convincing the heart that the story is finished. And this is where the realization begins to hit them in a completely different way, because your soulmate may finally be discovering that silence did not make you easier to forget. If anything, the distance gave their memories more room to speak. When you were present, there were conversations, distractions, routines, and new moments constantly replacing old ones. But once everything became quiet, the little details had nowhere to hide. They could surface whenever they wanted. A song could bring you back. A familiar expression on someone else's face could remind them of you. A place they once passed without thinking could suddenly feel strangely familiar. Even something as simple as hearing a phrase you used to say could stop them for a second. And perhaps they have started noticing how often this happens. At first, they may have dismissed each moment as coincidence. Then another memory appeared. Then another. Eventually, coincidence starts becoming difficult to believe. They begin asking themselves, why does this keep happening? And perhaps the answer they are slowly approaching is one they weren't prepared to hear, because some part of them never completely released the emotional imprint you left behind. Imagine trying to push a beach ball underneath the surface of the water. You can hold it down for a while. You can convince yourself that it is gone because you cannot see it. But the moment your grip weakens, it rises back to the surface. That may be what their memories feel like now. They thought silence had buried everything, but the smallest trigger keeps bringing something back. And the more they try to dismiss it, the more aware they become of how much they actually remember. This is why their silence may be starting to feel different to them. Before, silence could feel like control. It could feel like protection. It could feel like a way to prevent themselves from becoming emotionally vulnerable. But now, silence may feel like an unfinished sentence. They may wonder whether they should have said more, whether they should have stayed longer, whether they misunderstood something about you, whether you were feeling something they never gave you the chance to explain. And perhaps the hardest question is the simplest one. What does my silence mean to them now? Because your soulmate may suddenly realize that while they were using silence to protect their own emotions, you were left to create your own explanation for their absence. Maybe you assumed they didn't care. Maybe you thought they had forgotten everything. Maybe you believed the connection meant far less to them than it meant to you. And now they may be realizing that they never gave you the truth because they never fully gave themselves the courage to speak it. That realization can make the past feel surprisingly uncomfortable. They may replay moments where you were waiting for an answer they never gave. They may remember a conversation where you opened up and they remained guarded. They may remember the moment you finally stopped asking questions because you realized you were getting silence instead of clarity. And suddenly, what they once considered a simple ending can begin to look like a missed opportunity. Not necessarily because they are ready to return tomorrow, but because they are finally understanding the emotional cost of what they chose. You might be asking, does this mean they are coming back? Not necessarily, and that distinction matters. Remembering you does not automatically mean someone will act. Missing someone does not always mean they know how to reconnect. But it can mean something inside them has become impossible to ignore. It can mean the story they told themselves is no longer completely convincing. Their memories may be forcing them to look at the connection without the defenses they once used. And that is where the emotional shift becomes powerful. They are no longer simply thinking about who you were. They are beginning to think about what your presence meant to them. There is a difference. A person can remember an old acquaintance and feel nostalgia. But when a memory makes someone question their choices, their silence, and the version of themselves they were during the connection, that memory carries a different weight. Your soulmate may be entering that space now. They may be wondering whether they were too afraid, too proud, too uncertain, or simply too overwhelmed to recognize what was happening while it was happening. Imagine finding an old key years after you stopped looking for the door it belonged to. You hold it in your hand and suddenly realize that you never actually forgot the key. You only stopped searching for the door. That may be the strange realization happening inside them. They haven't forgotten you. They simply stopped allowing themselves to look closely at what the memories were telling them. And now those memories are looking back at them. They are forcing questions into places where certainty once existed. Maybe the connection was not as finished as they thought. Maybe the silence did not create closure. Maybe it only created distance while leaving the emotional story untouched underneath. And the more they remember, the harder it becomes to pretend otherwise. They may not tell anyone about these thoughts. They may not even admit them fully to themselves. But privately, they could be comparing the person they remember with the person they imagine you have become. They may wonder whether you still remember the same things, whether you ever think about those moments, whether you interpreted their silence as rejection, whether you have already moved on while they are only now understanding what they lost. That uncertainty can be deeply unsettling, because when someone believes they have forgotten you, they feel in control of the past. But when they realize they remember you in ways they cannot explain, the past suddenly has a voice again. And perhaps that is the real reason their silence is beginning to trouble them. It is no longer protecting them from the connection. It is making them aware of it. The silence that once seemed like an ending may now be the very thing reminding them that there was never a real goodbye inside their heart. And now we arrive at the realization that may be the hardest one for your soulmate to escape, because eventually they have to face what all these memories are actually telling them. They are not simply remembering a person from their past. They are remembering a version of themselves that existed when you were in their life, and that may be why these memories feel so much stronger than they expected. They may have spent a long time believing that the connection was something they could place neatly behind them, something they could label, understand, and move beyond. But now, the smallest details keep returning, and every memory seems to carry the same quiet message. You mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. Imagine a song you haven't heard in years, suddenly playing somewhere when you least expect it. Within seconds, you know the words. You remember the feeling. You remember who you were when you first heard it. That is what certain people become in our memory. They are not just people we remember. They become attached to entire emotional seasons of our lives. And perhaps your soulmate is realizing that you became attached to one of theirs. They may remember conversations you thought were ordinary, moments you didn't realize they noticed, and little pieces of your personality that you assumed disappeared with time. But now they are discovering that those things survived, and that realization can make someone question everything they believed about moving on. They may ask themselves, if I truly let this go, why does this person still appear in the smallest details of my life? They may wonder why your memory feels different from memories of everyone else, why certain moments with you still have emotional weight, why they can remember the smallest things about you while forgetting countless details about other people they have known since then. And perhaps the answer is uncomfortable because sometimes the mind remembers what the heart was not ready to release. This doesn't mean they have already decided what they are going to do. It doesn't mean they will suddenly appear with every answer or finally confess everything they have been carrying. But it does mean their internal story may be changing. The version of the story where you were simply someone they once knew is becoming harder to maintain. Now there are questions. There is curiosity. There may even be regret. They may wonder whether their silence protected them or simply prevented something meaningful from being understood. They may wonder whether you ever knew how much they noticed, whether you ever realized that they remembered the little things, whether you walked away believing they didn't care because they were too quiet to show you otherwise. And that question can stay with someone, because sometimes the deepest regret isn't losing a person. It is knowing that the person may have left without ever understanding how important they actually were. Imagine standing at a train station after the train has already disappeared into the distance. You cannot stop it. You cannot call it back. All you can do is stand there and realize that there were words you could have said before the doors closed. That may be the emotional space your soulmate is beginning to understand. Not necessarily desperation, not necessarily panic, but recognition. Recognition that silence has consequences. Recognition that time doesn't automatically erase meaning. Recognition that some connections remain alive in memory, even when communication has stopped completely. And this is why their silence may now feel heavier than it did before. Before, silence was something they chose. Now silence may be something they question. There is a difference. They may look back and wonder whether they were protecting their peace or protecting themselves from vulnerability. They may wonder whether they were truly ready to let you go, or simply afraid of what would happen if they admitted they didn't want to. And perhaps the strangest part is that you may not even know any of this is happening. You may be living your life, growing, changing, becoming someone they haven't seen in a long time, while somewhere inside their own mind, memories of you are quietly being rearranged. They may be comparing who you were with who they imagine you are now. They may wonder whether you still carry those memories too, whether you remember the same moments, whether you ever think about them when something unexpectedly brings the past back. But there is something you need to understand here. You do not need to chase these answers. You do not need to force a conversation. You do not need to remind someone of what happened. If the memories are returning to them naturally, then they are already having a conversation with themselves. And sometimes that internal conversation has to happen before any external conversation can ever become honest. Your soulmate may be realizing that you were never erased from their emotional memory. You were simply placed somewhere they stopped looking. And now something has opened that door again. Maybe it was a song. Maybe it was a place. Maybe it was one tiny detail that suddenly brought everything back. Whatever the trigger was, the result is the same. They are seeing the connection differently. They are questioning the silence. They are questioning the distance. They are questioning whether they truly wanted an ending or simply accepted one because they didn't know what else to do. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. They don't have to immediately know what comes next for their realization to matter. Sometimes the first step is simply admitting the truth to yourself. I remember. I still notice. I still wonder. Maybe I never forgot. Those quiet admissions can change everything internally. Because once you acknowledge that someone still occupies a meaningful place in your memory, it becomes much harder to pretend the connection meant nothing. Your soulmate may never tell you every detail they remember. They may never confess every moment that returned to them when they least expected it. They may continue to remain quiet while they figure out what those memories mean. But their silence no longer tells the whole story. The memories are telling another one. And perhaps that is the story they are finally ready to hear. You were not forgotten simply because there was distance. You were not erased because there was silence. And you did not need to chase them to remain meaningful. Some people leave your life and eventually become a faint memory. Others leave and somehow remain woven into the smallest details of ordinary life. Your soulmate may be realizing that you belong to the second kind. And maybe the reason their silence is beginning to trouble them is because deep down, they are finally understanding something they once tried very hard not to know. They didn't remember you because they were stuck in the past. They remembered you because what happened between you was never as insignificant as they once pretended it was.